Hey guys, what's it called? I'm just going to do a quick review of the NLT, the New Living Translation, that's produced by, I think it's Tyndale House Publishers. So basically, I was reading this translation for the last year. So I just thought I'd give some quick thoughts on it as a translation. So for those of you who don't know, there's two general types of translations that you can get when it comes to scripture. You can get translations which are word for word. Those are the translations which generally adhere more so to the original source text. So in the case of the Bible, that would be the original manuscripts for the Old Testament, the Hebrew and Aramaic, and then for the New Testament, the Koine Greek manuscripts. And then you have another translation type, which is thought for thought or sense for sense, where the target language is what's being emphasized as part of the translation strategies. So, for example, if you're in France, it's going to be a French translation of the Bible, and they're going to target the French language, which can generally mean that certain idiomatic phrases from the original source languages are lost in order to suit the target language and the target culture. So, where does the NLT fall into those two parties? Well, it would be more so, I would say, a sense for sense or thought for thought translation. So, it's a translation that I wouldn't say neglects the original languages, but it targets the English language more so than it does the original. So it takes its liberties where it needs to, so that it can easily render stuff so that there isn't, let's say, any confusion over certain terms or over certain idioms that were used, back in, I don't know, ancient Mesopotamia or, at the time of the Roman Empire. So what did I think of the translation? Overall, I thought it was a solid translation. I found it quite simplistic to read, which was good, I think, because some translations nowadays, like the ESV, the NASB 95, can be a little bit more complicated because they tend to be more literal translations, but they can be quite difficult for some people to read, especially if reading isn't your forte, let's just say. So it kind of depends on the type of reader you are, I guess. If you struggle with reading, or you find reading difficult or whatever, you for whatever reason, you find it difficult to pick up a book and read it for any length of time, the NLT is certainly a good starting point for a lot of people, I think, because it simplifies a lot of the stuff that's in scripture. A lot of the terms which can be quite difficult to understand, it tends to go to quite a number of lengths to explain those terms. But in saying that, the problem I generally find with translations that tend to simplify stuff is that in the original languages, in particular, there can be certain terms or certain ideas or concepts, theologically speaking, that can be quite complex. And when you try and simplify them, some of the original meaning that the authors had in mind can be lost. So, and that can happen generally as a consequence of what's called over-translation, where the translator kind of paraphrases a little bit too much what was said in the original. But the issue with that, of course, is that's based on interpretation. So if the translator has a particular idea of what a verse means, he's going to translate that verse in accordance with how he interprets the verse. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that another translator might have a different view of that same verse, and they might translate it a little differently. So that can generally be an issue when it comes to over-translation or taking your liberties as a translator with certain translations. Overall, as I said, the NLT is solid, but it is an easier translation. I wouldn't say it's as easy as something like the Good News Bible or the Message, but I don't think it's far off those translations. It is, very much so another term that you'll see in translation, by the way, is dynamic equivalence. But it is a translation that is simplified to make it easy to read for the reader. But as I said, the disadvantage to that can be that certain ideas or concepts can be lost that the original authors had in mind. So, for example, if you look at John chapter 12, verse 41 and John 17:5, I'm just naming some verses, for example, in this translation, or even something like one that a lot of people are familiar with, Mark chapter 8, verse 36, you'll find that the translations are very simplified, and in some cases they can be over-translated, where there's a lot of words that are just put into the verse to kind of make sense of what the original author was saying. But if you go back to the original manuscripts, you'll find that the author was using less words to basically say what he was saying. But the other thing then is that when you over translate or you simplify certain things, poetry can also be lost. So there's a lot of verses in scripture which are quite poetic, which makes them rather easy to learn. So if we go to, I'll give you an example. If we go to Mark chapter 8, verse 36. Now in the KJV, I think it says something like, what shall it profit a man if he were to gain the entire world but forfeit his soul? Which is a very poetic translation. But if we check what the NLT says, so this is Mark chapter 8, verse 36. It says, and what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Again, it's pretty much, it's saying the same thing, but I just, by being very direct and literal with the translation, there's a certain level of poetry that's lost. And what that can do, by the way, I find with verses, is it can make them more difficult to memorize. Because I find that when verses are very memorable and they're put in a very poetic way. I mean, poetry is a great way of actually remembering stuff. If you can like insert a form of rhyme, it can help with memory retention. But verses like that, if you kind of oversimplify them or over translate them, in this case, it's actually quite close. It's just a more literal version of it. But if we take something like John 17:5, in like the KJV and the ESV, it says something like, now glorify me, Father, in your presence with the glory that I had with you before the world was. But in this translation, it says, we'll just give another example, John 17:5. Now, Father, bring me into the glory we shared before the world began. Again, in this case, it's actually very simplified in the sense that there's way less words being used to say the same thing. In the original, it's actually longer. Now, the same meaning is being translated, but I think with the original, particularly with the fact that he says, now glorify me, Father, in your presence with the glory that I had with you before the world was, that's a bit more descriptive, I think. And by taking out some of that detail that's in the original, even though you're still kind of maintaining the original meaning of what was being said, you can kind of lose a little bit of that extra meaning that was there. And that's generally what happens when you become more literal in the approach you take. So, I mean, the question would be overall, like, who is this translation for? Which I kind of got into a little while ago, but I would say this translation is more so for people who perhaps struggle with the English language, as I said before, in the sense that they find reading difficult, or they're perhaps a non-native, so they're learning English. Now, there are even easier translations still than this. So the Good News Bible would be an example, or the Message. And there's other translations as well. But I think this translation would kind of fall into that. It's because in the German version, there's also a German version of this translation called Das Neue Lebenübersetzung, which is very, very similar. But translations like that are generally targeted for people who find reading tough. So either that could be a native speaker who perhaps struggles with reading, or it just could be for, as I said, non-natives that are learning the language and they just want, to join a Bible study and they want an easy translation that helps them, engage with it. That's certainly who this translation is for. I would say a third group that this translation would be for is for people who are probably reading scripture for the first time. It's certainly good to have a simple translation nearby to kind of get a handle of what scripture is saying throughout, because it can help you kind of get a good grip of everything that's going on throughout. But in saying that, what I would say is if you get a really good handle of scripture, let's say you've read it twice or something, you've read the whole thing twice, it probably is of benefit for a person like that, especially if they have a good level of English, to move on to a more challenging translation like the ESV or even the NASB 95, because these, or even the ASV, but the ASV I think is a little bit too challenging because it's one of the most literal translations you can find. But if as I said, if you are someone who has a really good grasp of the English language, so you're a native speaker and you read quite a lot and you don't really struggle with let's say difficult terms or jargon that might be used, I would certainly say move on from a translation like this. Move on to something more challenging, because if you go with translations that are closer, let's just say, to the original manuscripts, you're going to get more out of them, because these translations don't take their liberties. They try and, as I said, they target the source language and the source culture, and they try to bring all of that into the target language. Now, the down kind of side of that, of course, is that they can be quite difficult to read. So there are places, for example, in the ESV that can be quite challenging to read. Likewise with something like the KJV or the ESV or the ASV. These translations can have sections that can be very, very difficult to read. And that's why I said, even with those translations, it's always useful to have a simpler translation nearby just to check to see. But as I said, if you've read this translation and you're a native speaker and you have a very good level of English, I would say move on to a more challenging translation. You shouldn't really be sticking to this translation if you've already read it, you already have a good handle of scripture, and you're capable of reading a more difficult translation, because your aim should always be to get more out of it, right? And I think a translation like this, though it is good and though it has a purpose, it can be limiting for some people, because for some people, they might want to go deeper, but the problem with translations that are that target the target language, so if that's English, German, French, or whatever, it means that they tend to not neglect, but they definitely take their liberties with the original source text. Now, they do try to remain as faithful as they can to those source texts, but they do take their liberties, which means that certain things can be lost in translation, like certain idiomatic phrases or certain concepts that the original writers had in mind can be lost, right? If there was like more meaning that the original writer was trying to get out of a particular verse, if you start simplifying these verses, of course that meaning is going to be lost. So yeah, as I said, again, just as a summary, this translation is definitely for people, I would say, who either struggle with reading, and that's completely fine if you struggle with reading. It's great that we have translations there for people like that. So as I said, this would be a good translation for someone who struggles with reading, or the Good News or the Message or something like that. But if you have a good level of English, let's say an academic level of English, and you can, you don't really struggle with reading, if you've already read this, I think my recommendation would be to move on from a translation like this, move on to something that's more challenging, that's more word for word, that's more adhering to what the original, authors had in mind when they were writing what they were writing in those original languages, of course, with the culture at that time in mind. I would say move on to something more challenging, because you'll get more out of it, like the ESV or the ASV or the KJV, even though the KJV has some issues. So I would say the ESV for me is probably the best kind of modern translation, because it strikes kind of the perfect balance between readability as well as faithfulness to the original languages and the original culture. There was the NASB 95 is also very, very good, very, very faithful, and it doesn't really take its liberties for the most part. So that's another translation that I would recommend. That's pretty much everything I want to say on the NLT. So overall, solid translation. It does have a place, but as I said, it's just kind of, you have to decide as someone who's using the translation, is this a translation that you should continue to use? As I said, if you struggle, maybe perhaps with the English language, then definitely keep using it, because it is of benefit. But if you are someone who, as I said, has a very good level of English, it's probably time, if you have already read it and got to grips with it, it's probably time to move on to a more difficult translation. In terms of, just one final thing I want to say as well, is that just in terms of what I've planned to do in another video, if I do another video after this, I'm thinking of one of two things. Either we'll look at the doctrine of eternal security. It's also known as once saved, forever saved. I'm thinking of kind of going through that biblically to see if that's a biblical doctrine or not. I think scripture demonstrably proves that it's unbiblical. I don't think it's a biblical doctrine, and I will demonstrate that, not just from scripture itself, but also from the patristic authors themselves, the early church fathers, that this doctrine wasn't something that they upheld. So if they didn't uphold this doctrine of eternal security, why are we entertaining it or upholding it? And if scripture also has verses which clearly refute it, then why is it being upheld? That's a question I want to look at. and that would be a separate video. One other video I'm thinking of doing as well is I want to look at this whole denomination of Calvinism, because I'm quite intrigued by a lot of the kind of beliefs within that. Now, my question is, of course, is Calvinism something that's biblical? I don't think so. I think it's unbiblical, and I think that Scripture demonstrably proves that it is a false way of looking at Scripture. It's a false lens through which to try and understand Scripture, and I think it kind of limits in a number of areas how we understand God and how we understand ourselves in relationship to God. I do think it's sort of a heretical way of looking at Scripture. I don't think it's demonstrably proved by Scripture to be in any way true. And I will demonstrate that, of course, if we do get onto that in a separate video, how it's, for me at least, based on my own solid biblical exegesis, kind of a false set of beliefs. I just don't see anywhere in Scripture where it's really upheld in such a way that you can actually try and affirm it. But that will be a separate video, of course. And I just want to say as well that I do believe, though, in terms of Calvinism, this will be talked about in detail if we do this later on. I do believe that it is there is enough of the gospel, the actual true gospel that Paul talks about. If you go to Galatians chapter 1 verses 8 and 9, he talks about the fact there's only one gospel, there is no other. He says the same about Jesus. There's only one Jesus, there is no other. I do think there's enough of the gospel in Calvinism to find the real Jesus, but there's also certain areas of it that are very obscure and they're very limiting, and they can cause, I guess, a lot of confusion for anyone who's trying to view Scripture through that very narrow lens, and it can, in certain cases, I believe, actually pull someone away from what the gospel is actually saying. So that'll be a separate video, and I just want to thank you for watching the video, and I hope this was of benefit and you got something out of it.